I'm Janet Hurley. I'm with the Bennington County Regional Commission here with Samantha Page and Callie Fishburne, regional planners. And we've been working with the village on revising, updating, improving your zoning regulations, basically. And we've got a draft, some draft maps, and a draft new ordinance that brings together what have been separate ordinances in the form of zoning, subdivision, lighting, and river corridor and flood hazard regulations. They're all now going to be under this one roof. And I know that the Planning Commission is working on other things like even the sign regulations and getting them under this roof as well, but that's not part of this right now. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sam. She's going to give about a half-hour presentation, and then after Sam is finished with her sort of overview of what we've done here, we're going to open it up to questions. And just know that this is like the first, this is the initiation to you of what's being proposed at this juncture, and what we need is your input at this point, your reaction to it, and we have a month and a half of time that you can review it and provide feedback to us and to the Planning Commission. We have an online survey, we have some hard copies here, but let's let Sam do a sort of high-level overview, and then we'll let you, take a look at things more studiedly, but we'll also have questions and answers and comments and whatnot after Sam's overview. So go take it away, Sam.
Okay. Okay, so just to give an overview of what I'll be talking about for about a half an hour, like Janet said, we're going to do a really quick recap of the project so far and some of the engagement we did with you all this summer. And then I'll introduce the zoning districts that we've drafted and describe a little bit of their proposed dimensions and uses. We'll introduce the overlays, one of which is new and the others are just kind of like refreshes of things that you already have in place in the village. And then we'll give a couple more highlights of some of the major changes that are proposed in the draft and leave time for discussion and for more kind of milling about and asking questions and giving feedback.
Can everybody see and hear wherever you are?
Okay. Thank you. So, like Janet said, this project was initiated by the Planning Commission here in Manchester Village. So the Planning Commission hired BCRC to help with an update of the village's land use regulations. Part of the project's goals was for the community to understand what the current zoning allows for and doesn't allow for. And to do that, we led some engagement over the summer. We had a couple of meetings, and we did a couple of neighborhood tours. And those were ways for us to have community conversations about what you want the neighborhoods you live in to look like, the design, the development standards. And so that was all a process of gathering feedback and listening to what the community is hoping to see in your zoning regulations. And now we're in this sort of last stretch of the process where we're updating the documents and the maps to reflect what we heard from all of you over the summer. And as Janet said, this is kind of the first step in showing you what those drafts look like, and there will be more time for feedback going forward. So just to show off some of the fun things we had going on with you all this summer, we had a kickoff meeting where people grouped different character areas by photos. And then we had 3 neighborhood tours in the northern, central, and southern parts of the village to really understand what the historic development patterns look and feel like in the village and how the zoning currently may or may not actually allow for similar types of development. And then we ended with a design your own zoning map activity, and we have one of the maps actually up over there if you want to take a look at it later. This exercise was really informative for us. Hopefully it was fun and informative for you, and it served as the starting place for the proposed maps and draft that we're going to talk about today. So those conversations were really the foundation of what we've drafted going forward. So some of the takeaways from the conversations that we had over the summer were about your community's values around development. We heard that you didn't want to have commercial creep into some of the more residential areas in the village, that non-historic large commercial should be kept separate from the more traditional historic parts of the village, that you don't want to see large expanses of parking lots. You like mixed use that maintains the sort of traditional village character. You also think that conversion to multi-unit residential is okay when that historic design is maintained. So the sort of design standards are a big part of what's important to how the village maintains its character. We also heard that the condos, apartments, and senior residential communities are a really important part of the village's housing stock. It's valuable to you to incentivize the maintenance of properties, especially the historic structures in the village, and that the treed streetscape is also a really important part of how the village feels and maintains the character that you love about it. So we also had some more specific observations about the zoning as we did our tours, and those became kind of these key takeaways that are helping to inform the proposed regulations that we have now. So, for example, we noticed that there's a mismatch between the historic development patterns and what the current zoning allows for, especially in the business district on this section of Main Street. We noticed that setbacks currently are required to be 75 feet from the front of the property. And a lot of the structures that we looked at that people said they really love and feel like they represent what the village is all about for them, those setbacks were only like 10 feet or 15 feet. And so on many lots, we learned it's not possible right now to build in the traditional pattern unless you get a variance or a waiver. So that was a really important lesson for us. The business district also includes a really wide mix of uses, including residential, offices, lodging. And so one of the takeaways is that the label business district doesn't accurately reflect the mix of uses that you currently have and that we heard people want to continue to see in that area. Similarly, some of the rural residential zoned areas didn't feel very rural to people. There are parts of what is currently rural residential that is a little bit denser in parts of the village. They're smaller lots, they're closer together, they're a little bit closer to the street, and so many of those lots are not conforming with what the current zoning requires. And the current boundaries of those districts don't reflect meaningful changes in character. So there's boundaries where the neighborhood feels the same, but their lots are all in different zoning districts. For the Equinox Historic District, this is a zoning district, but it's based on a planned unit development area, and planned unit developments don't need to have their own zoning district, and in fact it could pose a challenge going forward if the Equinox Resort wanted to sell off parts of the land that it owned under that district. So we think that it's one of the takeaways is that it might be overcomplicating the zoning in that area by basing it entirely off of a planned unit development, and it might create kind of superfluous districts in a way that muddies the waters. And then another big lesson learned was about the Southern Vermont Art Center, which is currently in the Forest District. And so any changes that the SVAC would want to make right now would be considered non-conforming and would potentially be prohibited. So these are just some of the sort of top takeaways that we had, and as we progress, hopefully it'll be clear how those have been shaping the recommendations that we're making. So we'll be coming back to these images a couple of times over the night, but just to sort of start us off, the current zoning is on the left, and what we're proposing in our draft tonight is on the right. And now I'll talk you through sort of how the districts are shifting a little bit, and then how those uses and dimensions within each of the districts will change. So right now, where you have business 1 and 2 along sort of this main stretch of the road, we're proposing changing the name to mixed use 1 and 2, and changing the footprint a little bit. We're proposing that the mixed use 1 district would also incorporate the Equinox Resort and parts of the BBA campus, which are in their own sort of the Equinox Historic District and partly in the Village Residential District now. For the multifamily residential district, which is currently in the northeast part of the village, we're proposing calling that multi-unit residential 1, and then also introducing a multi-unit residential 2, which would encompass the footprint of where Equinox on the Battenkill is right now. So another area in the village where there's already multi-unit residential housing. There currently in place is a village residential district, which is very close to where we are right now. So it's the sort of Dillingham and Franklin area in the red. Oh yeah, thank you. So that's the village residential district under the current zoning, and we're proposing expanding that so to also include some of the areas along Main Street that we heard have more of a dense village residential feel and have smaller lot sizes that are closer together. And then we're also proposing introducing a village residential 2 that extends sort of along the corridor going north and south and along part of Taconic to the west. And this again reflects some of the feedback that we heard, that those areas of the village also feel a little bit more like a compact village residential area, although, as I'll explain, they have different dimensional standards than the village residential 1.
There's no distinction between 1 and 2.
There will be, yeah, there is. And I'll talk through the dimensions in just a minute. Yeah, there is a distinction between the lot sizes and the setbacks. So as I mentioned, the Equinox Historic District we're proposing gets sort of dissolved, and that property would be incorporated into mixed use 1 and village residential 2. For the rural residential, currently you have 4 rural residential zones throughout the village, and we're recommending just one big all-encompassing rural district that would reflect the interest in larger lot sizes, more open space, homes that are more spaced out, and a district that has more restricted uses, so really preserving that open space. And this still includes a lot of the land that is currently under the different rural residential zones, but hopefully would be a little bit more streamlined. And then finally, you have a forest district right now that's a pretty small geographic area along the western side of the village, and this draft proposes adapting that to be a village open space district, so that would continue to include the forested lands in the village, but would also include the 2 golf courses, parts of the Hildene campus, areas that are really important open space and that we heard you don't want to see developed into housing or commercial space, but with a title that a little bit is a better reflection of the variety of uses within this open space umbrella. So I'll talk through the dimensional standards, and on the left side of these slides you can see the sort of proposed standards in the white color, and then in the gray is what is kind of the closest zone that resembles this and how the standards are right now. So as I mentioned, one of the big takeaways from our walking tours was that the dimensional requirements for this area of Main Street in the Business 1 district right now, it requires pretty large lot sizes. 40,000 square feet is almost an acre. So it's requiring large lot sizes with pretty significant setbacks from the front, side, and back. A lot of the buildings that are out on Main Street right now and that are following this sort of historic pattern of development don't conform to those standards. And so we're suggesting a mixed-use 1 district that has slightly smaller minimum lot areas, so you could build smaller and still be part of this sort of more historic style that people really love about the village. And then mixed use 2 is more of this sort of large scale commercial footprints where the Orvis campus is and the Shaws, and that's meant to kind of create a very designated space in the village for those larger scale commercial spaces that they're still important, but they is a very specific place where they belong. So here, sort of getting to the question before about the different village residential zones, the village residential 1 that we're recommending has a very similar set of dimensional standards to what's currently in place in the village. So similar minimum lot size and similar setbacks. And then village residential 2, which is a new proposal, would have a slightly larger minimum lot size to reflect that those are a little bit less dense areas. There's more room for setbacks, a little bit more open space, but that these parts of the village where the dark purple is still feel like walkable parts of the village that people want to sort of continue to feel like an extension of Main Street and the sort of dense core, but just a little bit more spaced out. So for the multi-unit residential zones, multi-unit residential 1 is really the same area as where your current multifamily residential is, and that includes Equinox Terrace and the Meadows and the Maple Street School. We're proposing a slightly reduced maximum residential density. So right now it's 12 and down to 10. Just the current density of those structures hasn't gotten close to those numbers yet. So it still leaves room for more density in an area where there is some, but just kind of dials it back a little bit. And then multi-unit residential 2 is a new proposed district that maps onto where Equinox on the Battenkill is, and there's already multi-unit residences in that area, and so this just does a better job of reflecting what's there and what you might want to continue to see in that part of the village. And then finally, for the rural district, these dimensional standards map most closely onto what your current rural residential 3 is, and that's the largest geographic zone in your current zoning regulations. And so sort of similar dimensional standards with 50-foot front setbacks, 30-foot side setbacks, so it really preserving more open space on each lot. The maximum lot coverage is 20% of a parcel, so that's a lot of space left that's not going to be developed. And then for the village open space, there's currently really no dimensional standards for the forest because it's so restrictive, and this creates a little bit more guidance but still has very restrictive dimensional standards. So the minimum lot size for developing would be at least 10 acres, and the uses, which we'll get into next, are pretty limited for that zone. Okay. So for the uses, we'll sort of go by category. For the residential uses, they're really focused on the mixed use 1 district, which is Main Street, the 2 village residential districts, and the rural district. As you can see, multi-unit dwellings would be permitted in almost all of the districts across the board, but otherwise it's sort of a focused look at residential in just a couple of parts of the village. For lodging, this again is focused in the mixed use 1 area of the village, so where the Taconic and the Inn at Manchester and the Equinox Resort already are. And then there's some conditional allowance for lodging in rural. And then in terms of commercial uses, these are also really focused on the mixed use 1 and 2. Again, going back to some of the feedback we heard from you all, that you want to focus commercial in certain parts of the village and not let it kind of seep into other areas. So most of the commercial uses are in mixed use 1 and 2, and then there's some conditional allowance for personal services in other areas. Do you mind if we wait? Oh yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. P is permitted, so like allowed by right, and C is conditional. Thank you. Yeah. For community uses, a lot of these are permitted or conditional throughout different areas of the village. For example, like I'm trying to pick things, like a public garden, sort of right this row, is permitted almost extensively throughout the village, with the exception of multi-unit residential too. But you can kind of pursue that community use in almost any district. Whereas like outdoor sports fields or facilities are conditional in a couple of the districts. Maybe you want to be more selective about where you allow those. So again, this is sort of a little bit more on a case-by-case basis, and we can get into the details more in the discussion section if you have specific questions. And then finally, there's a use category of natural resources, and these are really focused in the rural and the village open space areas, although we're recommending that farm stands be conditionally allowed in the mixed use areas and the multi-unit residential 1. Maybe that's something you want to see a little bit more throughout the village. And then primitive camps are conditionally only allowed in village open space. Okay, so we have a couple of overlays that we'll go through, and so overlays, like the word sounds, are kind of applied on top of the base zoning. So these would be applied in addition to whatever the underlying zoning district is in the village. And the community housing overlay is born out of the Home Act that the state passed last year. And the Home Act requires that wherever there is municipal water and sewer, that local regulations allow for a residential density of at least 5 units per acre. And so this is state statute that's already in effect, and the proposal to have an overlay is to make it more clear to anybody trying to understand where that's being implemented. So this sort of white hash line over the zoning illustrates the extent of both municipal water and sewer. So this shows where both of those utilities are in effect, and if there are parts of the village where where there's sewer but not water, it wouldn't show up in this sort of proposed overlay. And so again, this is illustrating where that state law is in effect, and the goal is to just help make it more clear and more streamlined for everybody to understand the footprint of that. And so that's why we think it would be a helpful overlay to include in your regulations. The design review districts are already in place in the village. We're proposing updating the name of the village corridor overlay, which currently is called the preservation district. So this is just a little bit of a refresh so that it's a little bit more clear what the overlay is applying to. So as you can see with the light blue, the village corridor overlay follows the main road corridors throughout the village, and the renaming is just meant to reflect that. And then the other major change for this part of the ordinance is to change the order that they're nested in. And so right now they're nested in the reverse of what you see on this list, but our proposal is to start with the general review overlay, which applies to the whole village and has the least restrictive of the design standards, and then go to the village corridor overlay, which has slightly more restrictive design standards but a smaller footprint, and then finally go to the historic core overlay, which has the most restrictive design standards. And the hope is that it makes it a little bit easier as you're reading through, that what you read at first applies everywhere, and then you're getting a little bit more focused in the standards that you're looking at. For the flood hazard and river corridor overlays, as Janet mentioned, these are currently in a different document on the village's website. And so if you were looking for ordinances for flood hazard regulations on your property, and you went to the zoning regulations right now, you wouldn't find them there. And so our main goal with including this is just to make it easier to see all of the regulations in one document. And then I think the language has been updated a little bit to reflect the Agency of Natural Resources model guidelines. But otherwise, this is kind of just moving it from one place to another, where hopefully it will be easier for you to use.
There is another area that's flooding a lot in West Union Street with
Okay.
Equinox Hill. Floods the fields and the houses below.
Oh, okay.
Not on that map.
Okay. This map is made using the State Agency of Natural Resources like mapped flood hazard areas, so it wouldn't. It's following a pretty like strict national guideline, but we can talk about how to reflect that in the. And then just to kind of give a broader summary of other sort of changes throughout the document, that the goal is to eliminate any redundancies, try to clarify and make the document read a little bit more in a more streamlined way. As we said, it brings different ordinances into one document under one roof so that it's easier for you to find all the regulations you might need to consult in one place. There's a definition section at the back that we tried to beef up a little bit so that it's including all the terminology that's referenced throughout. And then we think that this is doing a little bit more thorough of a job of addressing some of those climate and housing challenges that the village is seeing. So this is just a snapshot of the table of contents. And then I'll give a couple more highlights before we wrap up. So currently the surface water setback throughout the village is 70 feet. So anywhere that there's a stream that's not on that map that I just showed, it would still have a 70-foot setback from where you can build around that area. And we're proposing introducing a more flexible water setback. So it would be 3 different setbacks depending on where you are in the village. So in the sort of denser central core, like the mixed use and the village residential areas, the setback from the surface water would be 30 feet. And then in the multi-unit residential areas, it would be 45 feet. And in village open space and the rural areas, it would be 75 feet. And we're proposing that within those setbacks, there's sort of 3 tiers of what you are allowed to do in the setback. So in the first third that's closest to the water, you would only be allowed to kind of maintain indigenous woody vegetation. So that would be a protective measure for the water body itself and for anyone living near it. In the middle zone, you could have some more natural landscaping and a little bit of clearing. And then in the sort of final third of the setback, you could have more manicured landscaping and temporary structures allowed. And so it tries to give a little bit more flexibility, both based on where you are in the village and what you can do within that setback. Right now, the setback is just 70 feet no matter where you are, and there's no flexibility for what's happening. It's just a prohibited area for development. We did a little bit of updating for the parking lot landscaping standards. So currently businesses are required to screen around large parking lots, and we heard that community members really don't want to have to look at large expanses of parking, not just not look at it, but don't want to have large expanses of parking surface. And so this builds in a little bit more specificity on breaking up large parking lots with landscaped islands or sort of trimmed areas between parking rows. And so as an example, this is the parking lot across from the Taconic, and it actually almost already meets these requirements. We just added like a little tiny example of another landscaped island to show what it would look like to be fully meeting these requirements. So a lot of businesses in the village are already doing this kind of work to break up the asphalt lots, and this just kind of makes the expectations even clearer. I think there is a light.
There's a lighting section and parking lot lighting. Yeah. And I don't think we changed much. The lighting regulations were separate from the zoning, and we brought them in, but we've tried to maintain the standards that you had, so.
And then the zoning ordinance has sort of spelled out regulations for planned residential developments, or PRDs, and planned unit developments, or PUDs. And these are different types of subdivisions that allow for the flexibility of use and design if the developer comes forward with a site plan that unifies all of the development they're trying to do and that advances some of the other goals of the village. So for example, if you're a residential developer and you want to build a subdivision of 10 homes and you propose a site plan that clusters the homes together and puts in an open space protection around the surrounding land, the other parts of the parcels, then you could qualify for a density bonus. So you could kind of incentivize developers advancing the village's goals, and then they're more likely to do that, and you're getting something that you want out of it too. So this is sort of spelled out in much more detail, but that's another piece of what we're proposing. And then the Act 181 was also passed this year by the state, and you might have heard of this as an Act 250 reform bill, but it also folds in some requirements for updates to municipal zoning. And so all of these are required by state law, and they have been incorporated into the draft so that any zoning ordinance that you adopt going forward would be fully compliant with the state law. So this includes expanding on-farm activities that qualify as an accessory on-farm business, some housing rules, like the lot sizes for duplexes cannot be more restrictive than what you require for single-family homes. In the proposed community housing overlay that we talked about, the lot sizes for multi-unit residential can't be bigger than what you would require for a single-family home. The affordable housing density bonus was put in place last year in the Home Act, but the state this year, the legislature clarified that the 40% is rounding up, so that's just like a technical detail.
Where does that money come from? These bonuses?
Oh, it's allowing the developer to increase the density of the development. So they would be able to build more units than what the sort of base zoning requires. So it's not being funded necessarily. They're able to build to a higher density.
By conforming to what?
By being affordable. So
What's
if it
affordable?
meets,
What's affordable?
it's defined, I mean.
Like
it's-
meeting certain income
It's defined in
requirements.
state statute, and it'll be clarified in the ordinance, so.
Like meeting certain income requirements.
I think anyone's clear what affordable means, actually.
There's a definition in state law, Anthony.
Huh?
There's a definition in state law.
Do you know what it is? I don't know.
I mean, I can't recall it right now, but and it's clarified in the ordinance, so. It's not just anything. It's not just, you can't say, oh, I want to build affordable housing, and I want a 40% bonus.
And in order to meet that requirement, there's other things required too, like walking distance to certain, like grocery store.
So I think you're thinking about priority housing projects and getting an Act 250 exemption. And there you have to have walkability and that sort of thing. This is if a developer has some property and they want to build housing on it, and they want to build a lot of it, they can't get that 40% bonus unless that housing meets the affordable housing definition in perpetuity. So if, the other thing is though that because of the cost of land in the village of Manchester, you're not going to see this happen. You're not going to see somebody purchase a large lot in the rural parts of Manchester Village and propose affordable housing on it. You might see some affordable housing development where we already have it, where the fields and the meadows are. That could be redeveloped to have more of that under this kind of scenario, but this is now state law. So across the state where there is zoning and you have density limits, if a developer meets the affordable housing, definitions, you have to allow them to have 40% more units if they want them. So that's what this is. Oh, and actually that was from the Home Act. You already have that in your regulations because you did that last year. This is just rounded up to the nearest total unit clarification that came out this year.
Okay. And then just to kind of close out, as we said at the beginning, this is kind of the kickoff to give you a sense of what the draft includes, but by no means is the end of the conversation. We've made the whole PDF available online, and we have some pieces of paper with this around the room, so you don't have to write it down, and we can also circulate the PowerPoint, so rest assured this will be accessible to you. So you can take a look at the draft, and then there's also a survey online that asks some guided questions about what do you think of the zoning districts and what do you think of the design standards. And so that's online. We have a couple hard copies here. We'll also provide some hard copies to the village office. So we hope that you'll provide feedback and questions for as many different areas of the plan as you have them. We're asking for the feedback by the middle of November so that we can take it all in and absorb it and make changes to the document, and then a finalized version of the proposed regulations will be delivered to the Planning Commission in the village by the end of January. And then even that is not finalized in the sense that the Planning Commission can continue to do what you want with it. So it's finalized from our end, but not from your end. So this is sort of the timeline moving forward.
And once it's delivered to the Planning Commission, if it wants to pursue adopting these regulations, the Planning Commission has to hold a public hearing, and then after that public hearing may make some changes, then the Planning Commission could forward it to your Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees is the body that would then hold a hearing or more, and after the hearing is closed, they can then vote to adopt or reject or whatever. But there is a lot of steps before this becomes your new zoning.
However, as a member of the Planning Commission, and if you were here and you got a text from me last night, I appreciate your attendance. Earlier feedback is always nicer than waiting
Last
until we
minute.
get,
Yeah.
to propose this in January. So, reminding you're a friend and you're here, I appreciate you coming, and would love for you to participate so that everybody's happy.
Right, before you put it to the trustees.
Correct.
So that you know what you're putting to the trustees is what makes people happy.
And did you want to give that example?
Oh, sure. So I just want to give you an example, for instance, of right here. So I was looking at this today, and I was thinking, these two lots here, they're used by BBA, and this one is mostly parking right now, right? And what if BBA decides not to use those two lots anymore? What if it decides they want to sell those two lots? My impression is that it should probably be in the Village Residential 1, because you'd probably rather see housing, houses like you see along Franklin and Union there instead of a parking lot, right? And so that's one of the reasons that you don't turn a PUD into a zoning district, because it's that underlying zoning district that reflects the patterns of development that you want to see in your town or village, right? So I'm thinking, maybe it's a better idea to put these two parcels, this is Franklin here and this is Union, into the Village Residential 1, so that if BBA wanted to divest of those two properties at some point, they become housing instead of some sort of commercial or mixed use, the kind of commercial stuff that you see along there. And the same for, this is the Equinox Hotel, and this is the parking, and this is their back campus. And this very large lot that is currently undeveloped, it's next to the town's town shed. you know, you don't necessarily want that to become commercial if the hotel decides it doesn't want that property anymore, it's gonna sell it. You probably want it to be residential. And so we're proposing that that be part of this Village Residential 2 district rather than to be incorporated into the mixed use 1 district. So that's the kind of like observations and study that we want you all to be doing and to be thinking about in the next month and a half, and you know, maybe a little bit longer. That November 15th is not a drop dead, you know, date. It's just a target at this point. So, so we want you to be, you know, looking at it closely and thinking about what you want to see in your village in these various areas. Eric?
I just have one question. On one of the charts, you showed Act 250 where developers can come in and develop affordable housing or family units. Does our local zoning officer have any say in the design?
So your local zoning is separate from Act 250, and your local zoning applies, okay? So they're completely separate. They need to get a zoning permit, and they might need to get an Act 250 permit too, but they need to meet your local regulations.
I think he might be talking about the overlay, and for
It doesn't matter whether it's the overlay or not. Your local zoning,
The design review board,
So they have control
yeah, the design
of what it's
advisory.
going to look like.
So it would still have to go through all of the village design process that currently.
and the design standards are part of this ordinance, so they're in there as they are now. It doesn't change anything. But are you asking Eric about the community housing overlay in particular?
What I'd like to know is if there is a community housing project that someone proposes, will our local zoning officials have a say in?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there are aspects to that Act 250 reform that allow for Act 250 exemptions in core developed areas like villages and downtowns. And what that means is that it wouldn't require an Act 250 permit, but it still needs the local permit. So the local permit prevails in those cases if these projects get an Act 250 exemption.
Do you have any statistics on what percentage of the developed lots are in compliance or bumping up against some of the new design standards as reconfigured in these districts? So for example, the minimum front setback in the mixed-use 1 district, how much of the existing development is at that proposed 10-foot minimum setback?
I don't know off the top of my head, but we did look at, what the sort of prevailing setbacks were as we sort of redrafted these dimensional standards, and like with some of the lot sizes in like Village Residential 1 and 2 or the rural, we tried to make sure that we weren't creating it wouldn't be creating a whole host of newly non-conforming properties. So I think in most cases, the current setbacks are actually more restrictive than what the proposed setbacks are. So like with the business district, the 75 feet is much, there are more buildings that are already in the 75-foot setback than would be closer to the front of the property than 10 feet, if that.
Or what Sam, I think you're saying
Sorry.
is there are more structures in this mixed-use 1 corridor that are compliant with the 10-foot setback
Yeah.
than there are with the 75-foot setback. In fact, there are very few properties that are compliant with the 75-foot setback, that gray house across the street is completely within the setback. So that house is completely in what your zoning says should be front yard. And
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we were to change the minimum front setback to 10 feet, for example, just picking this one column here, the mixed use one, what percentage of the existing footprint is already at that 10-foot setback?
you're asking what percentage of the lots would comply? Is that what you're asking?
Are we then presenting an opportunity for new development that's closer to the roadway than
Yeah.
what's predominantly there now?
Yeah. I think a lot of these right here are at 0 setback. So, it's further than what a lot of them are.
I also just so Sam and Janet did like 98% of the work. I was mostly moral support, but the goal has been with the updating of these regulations is to make them more reflect what you currently see already. So I think again, as Sam was doing the bulk of the work for this, basing the setbacks off of an average of the setbacks that already are, that are observable out, on the street. And so trying to make your zoning regulations reflect the actual conditions that exist.
Well, the actual
and
conditions that you want to see.
That you want to see
Yeah,
them also.
so,
And I think to your point about sort of prospective future development, part of the goal in bringing these standards to be closer to what you want to see and what currently exists is that that would be the standard that everybody then complies to, instead of right now, if you want to build a house between two structures that come up to the front of the lot line, you might ask for a waiver or a variance, and the hope is to kind of end that practice or limit it much more so that you can still build to what the other pattern of development is without needing to ask for a waiver or a variance.
right, and it'll be more consistent rather than case-by-case waivers or variances. So, we, as Callie said, tried to reflect what was there with what we're proposing. And Sam could probably do a little GIS exercise to say, okay, let's put a 10-foot line down here and see how many of these comply and how many, don't.
That would be, I think, extremely helpful to have just desktop work done to understand what's there, so that we can just have a sanity check on some of these changes to the statistics of what's there.
Yeah.
Rather than our general sense of it. I mean, I think we can walk down the street and know that a lot of these buildings are much closer than 75 feet, but is it 10 feet, is it 15, I don't know. And that just having some,
Yeah, we can do that.
10 was pretty much the average, I think. is
Yeah,
what
but
but we kind of eyeballed it.
I'm
right?
happy to do a
Yeah,
more rigorous.
systematic,
yeah, I'll work on that.
Just, I guess, could you talk a little bit about how, the property line, front property line, is obviously the property line, right? So that's defined by what the property is, but then there's the town right of way or
Right,
village right of way.
there's the
and
road
they
right of way.
intersect.
So that's part of what we did on our walking tours, is we marked what the actual front property line is. The front property line is not the edge of the sidewalk. It's a little bit closer to the house. And so every street has a right of way width, and it's usually 3 rods, which is usually about 50 feet. So, but over here in the historic part of the village, it's actually more like 100 feet in places.
So how do people know what that right of way would be?
people
For
should
development
know,
setback
yeah.
purposes, yeah.
People, yeah, surveys, yeah.
But you can ask your zoning officer and,
Well, no, the zoning officer is not an arbiter of where a property line is.
no, but I mean, there's a list of like general right of way for
Yes.
the roads in the village. That's a helpful starting place.
Yeah, yeah. So, so basically if you have 100-foot right-of-way, then you go to the middle of the road and you measure 50 feet toward your house, and that's where your front property line is. But it's not exact. You need a surveyor to do that. So anybody that's proposing new development is going to have a civil engineering site analysis and plan, and that will be indicated on those plans. But
And I know there's a lot of structures and buildings that are in that setback,
yeah,
and in that village right of way.
right. Well,
Is there anything
there's
about?
not a lot that are in it. There's some that are right on it.
Does that mean
You're just
that the
thinking-
village is responsible for fixing the sidewalk?
Well, yeah,
front
the
of
sidewalk, yeah. If, the sidewalk is the village's, but if your front porch step falls within the village right-of-way, it's still your responsibility. I don't think the village is gonna fix your front porch step, so, But- does that answer your
Yeah.
question, Claudia?
So there may be things that are in the village right of way, whether it's a fence or landscaping or whatever.
Right.
It's existing, but anybody who would have to do a survey and know where that setback is, where that village right of way is when developing. And have that.
For new development, yeah. I mean, if somebody's putting up a picket fence, that's, right now it's current, he's your administrative officer. And he would ask that you show, where you're gonna put the fence, and you have regulations about fences in the front yards. You can't have certain heights and, so that needs to be shown on a site plan before you get your zoning permit. So even if it's not new, a completely new development, it's just somebody that wants to put in a new kind of fencing or something, it has to meet the design standards and it has to meet the setbacks for whatever type of fencing is.
Building without construction. You get anything that requires a permit, would then you have to show where it is in terms of
Yeah.
the village.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Okay, well, thank
So,
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you, and
Feel free to mill around and kind of look at the bigger posters that we have up and grab copies of maps if you want to bring them with you, and make sure that you know how to find.
Well, and
Yeah, so-
we'll send out a copy of the presentation if you signed it.
if you signed in with your email, then we'll send the PowerPoint and the draft and the link to the survey.
Okay?